special session, which is a ministry of the Episcopal Church. It's a camp. It's a summer camp that is for people of all abilities to come together. And she's been initiating a lot of new programs and structure around that, which is really very exciting. Lindsay is also a DONA-trained birth doula, and so you can ask her what DONA is, and a volunteer doula with the Birthwell Partners Community Doula Project. Lindsay is also a graduate of Wake Forest School of Divinity, and that's how I came to know her when she was a student there. And I'll say, she's the perfect person to talk about, well, birth and rituals. She did an astonishing senior project on birth rituals, and she's also herself quite skilled at coming up with rituals for any occasion at all. I always really appreciated that about her sensibility about how to create a sacred space, and I'm looking forward to what will happen in our space today. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm going to stand up here just so I can see my presenter's notes, but since we're a smaller group, I'll try to not be too far back here. I'll walk around to the other side. So the title of my presentation today is on attending birth. So whatever we do ritually to be connected to birth or new life rituals, I would say the biggest thing that we can do is just to learn to be attentive. And I believe this is true for most sacred events in life or big transitional events, is thinking about just what it means to attend with an amount of presence and contemplation, to just be in these moments. So this is a really amazing photograph, of course, of a moment of birth, of transition from womb to world. So I'll start by telling you some of my background. Some has been said, but so I am a DONA-trained birth doula. DONA previously stood for Doulas of North America. Now it's just DONA because they're an international organization. A birth doula is somebody who provides informational and comfort support to somebody who is birthing. Something to clarify, I'm not a midwife, and what midwives do is medical support. They might also provide some of the comfort or information that a doula would provide, but that's not really their job description. So today, most midwives are nurse practitioners, and they often work in hospital settings, although they do home births as well. So a doula is non-medical. I have no medical training at all. What I am trained in is how to give somebody comfort when they are birthing, how to help somebody imagine and envision what they want from their birth. I'm there to be an advocate for somebody, to be a person supporting them in their needs. And I am there to witness and to be there as a constant presence. So the way birth works in America today, your doctors, midwives, and nurses are, for the most part, going to be periodically checking in on a birth, and a doula provides constant care. So that's a big difference, to have somebody who's in the room throughout the whole process, which can be short, but it also, of course, can be quite long. So a doula gets there at the beginning of the birth and doesn't leave. For me, I often meet with my clients beforehand, and that's pretty typical of doulas as well. So you do some imagining and envisioning and just letting the person know their options for the birthing room. I also have a background in Christianity. I graduated recently from Wake Forest School of Divinity, which is where I did more of this work around thinking about birth rituals, and also birth in theology. So what does it mean for us to think about birth in a Christian theological context is primarily where my research was. Something I'm not an expert in is birth rituals in the many different faith traditions that are represented here or in this broader organization. So that's something that I hope y'all will bring your knowledge to this conversation, because that's something I love to learn more about. And I've encountered some of it, but it's really not where my expertise is. So let's get a definition for rituals, which are a hard thing to define. But this comes from Ronald Grimes, who I will use a lot in this presentation, or I've used a lot in my thinking. He was a ritual theorist, and his book, Deeply Into the Bone, explores rites of passage and new life rituals as rites of passage in particular in the first few chapters. So his definition says that rituals are collective, meaningful, participatory, sacred functions that negotiate a person's humanity. So rituals are how we define humanity, both collectively and individually. This is distinguished from rites, although there's some fuzziness between them. Rites, R-I-T-E-S, are more of those broad cultural things that we think about happening in my tradition. Things like baptism would be a rite, things that are established and have that broad cultural, religious, often support. Rituals and ritualizing actions could be something that you just do among your family, you could just do with yourself. It has a much broader and kind of fuzzier definition. Ritualistic behavior is non-utilitarian and expressive. So it's not to accomplish a certain specific task, or it might have a double meaning there, but it is separated then from non-ritualistic behavior, which is means-oriented behavior that you do specifically to accomplish something. So rites emerge out of ritualization, but the two are kind of distinct there. And ritualizing action might be a little bit less intentionally. It might be things that we see as culturally embedded, but when we really go back to look at them, they instill certain values, and they do that defining, as it says in this definition, of what it means to be a person or to participate in society as a human being. And Ronald Grimes says that birth is the least ritualized of the great human transitions. So when we think about other events in humanity that are really big ticket items, right, like death is, of course, a good example in how it parallels birth. We can think about the way that ritual is so much a part of that human experience. So when we have the word death, for example, we have funeral as a ritual action that goes along with death. It's not necessarily going along with just one religion or one faith. We know that funeral means a ritual around death. When we think about marriage, we have wedding, which again could be reflected in a lot of different faith traditions, but we know that it's a ritual act that attends to this moment of transition. We have initiation for coming of age, but for birth, there isn't a big ritual word like that, right? Because birth isn't ritualized in the same way. Now, something we can note is that there are, in many religious traditions, prominent rites that are sort of a second birth, or they might use the language of birth, but they're not really connected to the birthing event itself. So baptism would be an example of that. There is often a lot of language around birth, and it might be about a spiritual birth, but it's not necessarily or even often connected to the act of birthing that has happened. So we have sort of a scarcity of birthing rituals in the industrialized West. And we can look at some reasons for why that is. And some would say that the birth ritual, or that the physiological act of birthing is just self-evidently sacred, right? So it doesn't really serve it to add all of this ritual around it because it's so powerful that it doesn't need that. Now, a critique of this would say, well, we have other acts that you might consider to be self-evidently sacred, like, for example, death, and yet this tends to call more ritual attention. So this might not be a good argument, a good reason why. There's also the argument that newborns are not yet persons, so they don't attract ritual attention. People are made. Sorry, I think that I have written that in reverse, but it should be people are made. People are not born but made. Okay, so we ritually define what a person is, right? So just because a creature has been born, it hasn't yet entered into society as a person. There are different rules around how we act towards newborns that might not fully acknowledge their personhood, and we see as they grow older, different maybe rituals or rites that we have that start to establish that personhood more. They move more fully into having rights, into having a construction of their own self that is acknowledged by the society. in a different way. One way to think about this as these newborns being not yet persons, or sort of in between persons, would be the act of circumcision as it happens in a hospital setting, not in a ritual setting outside of that, but in a hospital setting. It's often thought of as this event that, we should do to newborns in our society, newborn males. And the reason why it's acceptable to do that to a newborn baby and wouldn't be acceptable to do that for just anyone else non-consenting is maybe wrapped up in that idea of personhood, right? So they won't remember is maybe one way to think about it. But they won't remember is really never in any other setting, a good reason to justify why it's okay to inflict pain upon a creature, right? So there's some fuzziness there around why some things are acceptable with newborns. Maybe it is this acknowledgement that they're not quite moved into our society as persons. Another argument for why birth has had less ritual attention is because it's identified as women's work, and in patriarchal societies, women are undervalued, so birth is under-ritualized. Again, there might be different arguments for why this is or is not the case. There are other actions which we might identify as women's work that are ritualized. Menstruation is a good example, although maybe not so in our society, but in many ways it has attracted ritual attention. So this is a question. Another argument would be that technologically driven birth is so thick with medical procedure, right? There's so much to do on this sort of scientific scale that we just don't have time for ritual. Here again, death often is crowded with medical procedure and proceedings, and that doesn't mean we don't have rituals around death. So maybe also not quite a thorough argument for why this is happening or explanation. One last argument would be that perhaps in the West we do have birthing rituals, but we haven't named them as rituals. This is just a photograph of, obviously, this is a birthing scene, as you can see, in a very medicalized setting. So this work comes out of Robbie Davis Floyd, for the most part, who's an anthropologist who wrote a book called Birth, An American Rite of Passage. And her argument is that there is ritual around birth in America and in the industrialized West. We just don't name it as ritual. And some of the evidence that she points to are some of our scientific proceedings, which are not evidence-based. And so she says, instead, these have a ritual purpose. And this is true in a lot of medicine, but especially true in birth, that there are practices that have come to be common. Many of them are starting to be questioned now, but that came to be common over the last 50 years that really were not based in evidence that this was good for either the birthing person or the baby. Routine episiotomy, which is the cutting of the vaginal opening, there's not good evidence that this promotes any kind of faster birth or healing. Incubators, which is taking the baby directly right after the baby's born away from the parents and putting it into an incubator. Again, there's no evidence that this is good. In fact, it's to the contrary. The baby should ideally be placed skin to skin with another person, and yet it came to be a routine practice. Birthing in a lying down position, one more that there's no evidence that this is an ideal way or even a good way to birth. It works against gravity. There are better ways to be in position to have a faster labor, and yet this became not just suggested but mandated in many settings. So Davis Floyd sees this as a technocratic ritual, so that's performed at the hospital with nurses maintaining the ritual space and doctors performing the ultimate ritual acts. So we have people with this kind of knowledge that's not accessible to the others who come in to be ritually acted upon. We have certain actions that can only be performed by nurses and doctors for reasons that might be scientific, but we might also identify as ritualistic. They hold a different kind of power in that space in particular, and there's lots of protection of that space. And we see this in states like the state where I live in Alabama, where home birth is actually illegal. That we might think that there is medical evidence, or you might think that that backs it up, or that might even be used to justify it, but that's simply just not the case. So Davis Floyd's argument is then we should start to look at what are the ritual reasons why these practices are so protected. She identifies that the primary message of American hospital birth, so we have a ritual that's defining what it means to be human and what it means to be a part of our society. She says that the primary message is that the institution is more important than the family or the birthing person. So whatever it is that your needs are, if you're a person giving birth, those needs are not as important as the needs of the hospital and the society. So you give birth on the doctor's schedule or even the midwife's schedule in many settings today. You're attended to on their time, in their spaces. They make the calls about what is a good birth for you, and you don't have a lot of power in that situation. A good example would be the taking away of the baby as soon as the baby is born. So you've just birthed this human, and yet your desire to be with, your even medically supported reasons for wanting to be close to your baby, right? That's the healthiest thing for mother and child, is not as important as the institution's need to check out this new being, to clear them as evidenced for the society, as appropriate to enter into our society, right, as healthy. Even if those practices, like you could delay them by 15 minutes, for example, or delay them by an hour, and it wouldn't really change the medical outcomes in most situations. So the argument is that this technocratic right is co-opting the energy, openness, and vulnerability of birth to imprint some societal values upon the family, especially the mother or the birthing person. So this is this really powerful event that's happening, and it becomes a really important time for a message to be transferred. So this is a picture which I think really expresses some of that high priest, to me, idea of a doctor in the birthing room, right? The doctor is the one who has to catch the baby often, who has the first glance, who's there interacting, because in this setup, it's the doctor's baby. So the work of ritualization around birth and ritual attention to birth could also be called counter-ritualization, especially in those settings, but also even in the setting of home birth in our society today. We are thinking about even that is done in opposition to hospital birth, right? So it's still defined by our present moment and present practices. Now, saying that we should or that we can counter-ritualize against those actions, by that I don't want to imply that a hospital birth is not a good way to give birth or a safe way to give birth, or that these medical practices aren't good. They certainly save lives, and there are plenty of people who birth who see birth in the hospital as a way to claim agency over what they see as an uncontrollable process. And as a birth doula, and I think as anyone who wants to give this intentional attention to birth, the way to think about it is not that those practices are bad and we want to bring back good practices like the idea of natural birth, but instead to say that we want to restore agency, perhaps to the birthing person, or we want to be the ones who are able to instill the values that our traditions hold dear in that process, that we want to be participants. Again, a good mirror is to think about the way death is handled in many of our traditions. It's not to step in and say we don't need to have people, pronounced dead or medical attention to people who are dying, but it is, so we still want those things, but then it's to say that's not all that's happening here, right? We also have ways of talking about and engaging with this, what's happening, and we also have power in this situation. So the under-ritualization of birth is not to say that there are not birth rites and rituals, because there are many, particularly if we extend our understanding about what it means to ritualize around birth. So I have a list here that we'll use in our conversation about all the ways that we could conceive of birth rituals or rites, ranging from conception and fertility practices all the way from later celebrations and incorporations into your family, ethnic group, or religion. So birth isn't, of course, just that moment of leaving from womb to world, but encompasses perhaps the whole process of what it means to bring new life into the world, or to consider what it means to be beings who were brought into the world, or to consider what it means to be to participate in this process in ways that don't always produce life, right? And so we'll use that, and I would love to hear more from this group about the different ways that you've experienced New Life rituals and what the underpinning values are that you could find in those. So these are some of the questions that I've got for us to talk about in our small group about the different traditions represented here. And they're good ways to look into some of the rituals that we do have. Again, looking at this list, I think will help to create a broader understanding of what those could be. And there's only, I think, 5 of those, so we'll probably need to share across the groups. And do we want to have just one or two groups? Okay. Does it make sense just to split in the room since we're here? All right, I'm going to leave the questions up here, and then we'll talk for the next 20 minutes or so. Does that make sense? And then come back to a big group and share? Okay.